Good evening and welcome to the Reformed Church Center and to this evening's discussion around Bill Howard's new book, Black, Not Dutch, the Reformed Church in America's Response to the Black Manifesto. It's a really interesting book. If you haven't had a chance to get it, when you get your note tomorrow as a follow-up to this conference, you'll have information in there for getting the book. I am very glad to have you here. My name is James Brum, and I'm director of the Reformed Church Center. It is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker will be Dr. M. William Howard. Bill used to be director or what was the official title? I don't remember, but he was in charge of what was then the Black Council of the Reformed Church in America. He is a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and Morehouse College. He has been involved internationally and nationally in ecumenical organizations and other international affairs, especially in the Middle East and South Africa. He followed his work with the RCA by serving as president of New York Theological Seminary and then pastor of Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a trustee of the National Urban League and the Children's Defense Fund. He has chaired the Rutgers University Board of Governors and the New Jersey Death Penalty Study Commission of 2007, which led to the abolition of the death penalty in this state. He's currently a member of the Board of Directors of New Jersey Resources. And then responding to Bill and then being in dialogue with Bill is Nathan Jeremy Brink, who is the L. Russell Feeks Assistant Professor of the History of Global Christianity here at New Brunswick Seminary. He is a graduate of Calvin College, now Calvin University, McCormick Seminary, and Loyola University. I wanted to make sure I was assigning him to the right university. Loyola in Chicago is where he got his PhD. And so first Bill will be presenting for a bit, and then Nathan will be responding, and there will be some dialogue. And when that comes, we will bring others into the discussion. So without further ado, Dr. Bill Howard.
First, let me just thank you and Nate for hosting me here and for all the great people who've signed in. According to my computer, we are 52, and that's marvelous. A little bit of a crowded classroom, but great for Zoom, I think, huh? And what I would just say is, by way of getting the ball rolling, so to speak, because Nate and I have agreed that we're going to be informal and he's going to provoke me to say things that I wouldn't ordinarily say and so forth. And I like it that way. But this book, Black, Not Dutch, is really meant to cover the period between I would say really 1972 to 1986, but it references 1969. So we'd say 1969 to 86. Now, lots of interesting things have happened since 1986 that would be relevant if the book had been written later. And this is especially true of developments in South Africa, because after the book was written, the Reformed Church in America became the first Protestant church, or the first Christian church in the United States to host a non-clergy activist in the anti-apartheid movement from South Africa. We had hosted Bishop Tutu. We had hosted Dr. Busak. We had hosted other South African church leaders, as had other Protestant denominations in the United States. But the Reformed Church was the first to host a non-church political leader. And I'm going to say around 1986, 87 or so, the Reformed Church General Synod took place at Garden Grove Community Church, also known as the Crystal Cathedral. And we hosted Alfred Inzo, who was Secretary General of the African National Congress. And that was a very important major event, which led to the expulsion of the General Synod from the church to a local hotel, because God rest his soul, Dr. Schuler didn't want to risk having a member of the ANC physically at the church for concern about how his public would react. The second thing that transpired in 1990, of course, and the first delegation after 69 is mentioned in the book, but there was a second delegation that included Ed Mulder, who was General Secretary at that time, a very forward-thinking leader in the Reformed Church. He led a delegation, an interracial delegation to South Africa, which was a kind of breakthrough in terms of subsequent actions that the denomination would take. Then, of course, we have the substantial increase in Black women in ministry in the Reformed Church, which has to be mentioned since the writing of this book. We've had an uptick of Black leadership in predominantly white congregations. The RCA has left New York for Michigan, and as I would say, they've gone back home. They've left their old home and gone to their new home. And then, of course, the population of New Brunswick Seminary. Now, all of this and more, the book covers things that were precipitated by something called the Black Manifesto. The Black Manifesto was a demand from the Black Economic Development Conference that Christian churches and synagogues would pay reparations for their role in slavery and subsequent oppression and discrimination. And I won't rehearse that, but I want to say that that was a precipitating factor for everything that is written in the book. And of course, in April of 1969, James Forman, who was a veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, interrupted the worship service at New York's Riverside Church to present the manifesto for the first time. I came to the Black Council straight from Princeton. I was invited by Nida Thomas to an interview, and Sarah Smith, who was at the Bank Street College at that time, hosted the first sit-down conversation that I had with council leaders. And as I close my opening remarks, I'll just say I'm the second executive director of the African American Council, then the Black Council. I'm not sure what it's called now, but that group was initially led by a man whose first name was Stanley. And I can't recall his last name. I never met him, but he stepped down from the post due to illness and subsequently passed away. But I came in 72 and left to become president of New York Theological Seminary in 1992. So I was there for a good 20 years. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, or Doc Howard, right? I think would be an appropriate way. We thank you so much for sharing with us tonight and for lending your voice, but thank you also for just setting down your record in Black Not Dutch. As a practicing historian who works at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, I can't say how much I appreciate just the willingness of people to share their stories who experience these kinds of momentous, important events in the history of the Reformed Church in America, but really that events that are a kind of prism for us to think about and to examine and to teach with and to explore things that are so much bigger than just the Reformed Church in America, things that are really so much bigger than just the Black Manifesto. These may be our entries into it, but the ferment that's going on there around those events and the responses that are taken up in many ways is for us a kind of prism with which to understand and explore the social climate that produced that moment, but also that comes out of that moment. A moment that in reading Black Not Dutch, I couldn't help but feel like I was noticing time and time again, not repetition in our own day, because of course, as a historian, I can vouch history, of course, doesn't repeat itself, but it sure seems to rhyme. Mm-hmm. And so when we hear those rhymes, setting down a rich body of evidence and giving us your interpretation, some of which were already in the works in 1986, when I was a much younger person, giving us your recording of events and giving us your interpretation of those events and us finding that interpretation even and the ethical questions that raised still salient in our own exploration of our very different, new, and in many substantive ways changed social context is really a rich gift. So I thank you for that. Also, Doc Howard, you should know that my son, who is 7 and who has, yes, one parent, a father who is white and of Dutch descent, but also a mother who is Black and of Haitian descent, was able to see Black Not Dutch sitting on the kitchen.
Special meaning for him, huh?
Yeah, and he said to me, "Dad, that's me. I'm Black Not Dutch." Mm-hmm. And I said, "That's great, son. Tell me about that." And he said, "Well, I have some of my ancestors are Dutch,
right?
But I'm Black." And I said, that's great. That's true. And he understood, I think, one of the core ideas in the book, that a tradition that comes out of a strong ethnic identification, but over time is in many ways divorced from that and settles into a kind of normative white American framework, is not, it might like to think that it's defined by that ethnic identification, but for people in that tradition who are Black, the racial realities of the social milieu are more salient in different ways for identity and for practice. And so my son loved the cover and said, "I think this image is great." And I said, "Well, what about that?" And he said, "Well, the Black hand is holding the cross because Black is beautiful and Black should have power." And I said, "There you go." So the beauty of it is that in some ways, the thrust of your interpretation is something that even just in the title and in the cover image that you have here is something that even a 7-year-old can say, "I affirm things to be true about how maybe my story is told." And this is obviously not about my son, but I think the way in which you offer something that's rich and useful, even just on first glance is a really beautiful gift. I want to just flag for everyone who hasn't had a chance to read Black Not Dutch yet, some of the important contributions in Doc Howard's book are that he reframes, and he already sort of explained the periodization and opening up an insider perspective on some of these chapters that come after Noel Erskine's accounting, and offering us those contributions that really center the Black voices, and is trying to center the experiences of Black congregations. And in doing so, of course, Doc Howard's treatment is not suggesting that that the Black Manifesto and the perspective of Forman and of the National Black Economic Development Council is normative for all of the Black congregants and Black pastors within the Reformed Church in America. That there's an acknowledgement of multiplicity. Black congregations and Black people's experience is not monolithic. And oftentimes the framework with which white churches and white denominations, and quite frankly, white people in North America view Black experiences is too often seeking to find or project a kind of monolithic experience. And that's just not true. So the range of ways that Black congregants were receiving that, were thinking about political questions, were thinking about social and economic questions, was really a broad range. And so it's wonderful that we have a story that does that. One of the points that I felt that rhymed for me was how in Black Not Dutch, it begins, interestingly enough, with a 1955 statement from John W. Beardsley III that suggests that ethnic churches held on to their ethnicity, but in doing so, did so out of fear, and a fear of heterogeneity and change and social change. And the question that Beardsley poses at the end of that selection is, is it even possible to have a white ethnic church driven by fear, presumed to be operating out of the cause of Christ or embodying a compassionate Christianity? And of course, Beardsley's implied answer is no. You have to pay attention to the social context. You have to pay attention that fear-based ethnocentric isolation, protectionism, was no reasonable or ethical Christian way forward. And so to then, against that, situate the Black Manifesto and its aims, including some of the things that Doc Howard, that you point out, are including an economic ask, a real monetary demand, and including a broad-based educational demand, a reorientation of how churches and on all Christians in the United States, Black and white, would have to fundamentally grapple with the structural miseducation that puts slavery and anti-Black racism sort of embedded in the mix of Christianity, Christian theology, and Christian communities. And so coming out of that, the idea that even though there are limits, there are distinct failures in the Reformed Church in America to fully respond and grapple with all of these demands and make all of those structural changes. In some way, the Black Council and Black members and churches within the Reformed Church in America are endeavoring to do things that in some ways are left off of the organizational response. And that in some ways is where the smaller story gives an angle for understanding people's agency and contributions and advocacy in ways that the denominational response falls short. And those things that you mentioned, I really appreciated the centering of some of the Black women around Black Christian education, the centering of the Black Council in an authentic and meaningful extension of theological questions around apartheid, right? In ways that the RCA was not prepared nor able to do without their presence. So whether it was local and with asking those educational questions about Christian education and race, or whether it was global and asking questions of global power and colonialism and apartheid, those are things that are contributions that you have helped us get clearer focus about. And so it's really helpful to have these frameworks to think about the interventions that were made. Yet at the same time, I find somewhat disheartening in some ways that for all of these contributions, for all the things that have happened, we're still, even in our own day, brushing up against some of these limits, right? That when you say, well, it was finished in '86, but that there have been some structural changes, not all of those structural changes represent some great arc of progress, right? And in many ways, some of those things represent a retrenchment. I want to highlight, before I send it back to you to discuss some of these things that I've put on our table, Doc Howard, the conversation that we had at New Brunswick Theological Seminary in October of 2019 around the Black Manifesto featured the voices of Earl James, who was then coordinator for the RCA's African American Black Council and coordinator for advocacy. And he was, in his sort of final analysis, compelled to say that he found that these actions that have been taken have resulted in personal transformation, individual transformation, and can be measured as such. But he could not point to real evidence that would suggest structural change. And that's a tough takeaway point. It's a tough takeaway point in combination with panelists that we had at that event, Dwayne Jackson, co-pastor at Second Reformed Church in Hackensack, and Kelvin Spooner, pastor of Cambria Heights Reformed in Queens, who pointed out that there are glaring, persistent problems in the RCA around the church in terms of representation, resources that just aren't there, infrastructure that is not seeming to change. And as a sort of wrenching final piece of evidence, Reverend Spooner suggested that even by the 2017 General Synod, the recommendations by the Black Council for structural anti-racism components, including reinstatement of scholarship funds, staffing changes, reallocation of resources, greater specificity around anti-racism assessments, were not only not taken, were sort of brushed aside in the Reformed Church in America, but that further there has been, since that time, a move away in some ways from addressing racism to more and more seeking to frame advocacy around just the language of culture. And so there is in some way a kind of return to this idea, I think, that you begin with, that for all the proper analysis, for the insight, there have been people in the RCA who have not been lacking. But when it comes to broad-based change and the will to do so, that's where, whether we're talking about 69 and 74 and the 90s and the 2000 teens, we're in some ways looking at a kind of rhyme. And so I guess, from your perspective, how do we think about this, and how do we begin mining things from that evidence and from your interpretation of that past experience that might be life-giving and that might encourage a breaking of the rhyme in favor of a more just or a more representative or a restructured model, rather than just promoting the interests of just individuals or the insights of more individuals within a system that has so many structural issues.
Sure. Well, of course, none of this is new to me. And even, for example, your son's fascination with the title. You want to help him understand that segregation, racial exclusion was something that happened in the light. It didn't happen in the dark. And I'm speaking to you as an African American with noteworthy European features. And I offer that as the first bit of evidence. I can tell you that in my own family, women were raped by white men after dark. And so in my family, there are people of various hues. And Black, not Dutch, in a real sense, it's not a fair contrast or juxtaposition, because Dutch refers to a nationality, and Black refers to a sociological construct to justify the enslavement of labor. Black is a real socio-political fact, not only in America, but in the world. But in some ways, it's unique in America because the African was converted to someone who was Black and therefore placed, as Isabella Wilkerson would say, in a caste which is still with us. We've tinkered with the caste system and made certain cosmetic adjustments in the system. But structurally, America is bound by the sickness that was created before the founding of the nation. In fact, the Dutch came in the early 17th century, and they were quite involved, as was New York Seminary, as was New Brunswick Seminary, in the whole slavery business. So the country doesn't get founded until much later. And then you have more recent European immigrants, as Wilkerson points out, and I think she's a good guide in understanding that the conception of this. If we came from Italy, we didn't have a notion of Blackness, but we noticed that was the dominant framework to avoid persecution of yourself. So later European immigrants who came through Ellis Island actually began to adopt the notion of a Black underclass in order to deflect the kind of prejudice that would be aimed toward them. The Irish, another good example. So Blackness is a figment of our imagination, and it has a hold on us that defines the country. In fact, I noticed last night, I watched just a clip of the Georgia Senate debate. And the woman, Loeffler, a candidate who holds the post now, and Raphael Warnock, who is her opponent. And she kept speaking of socialism and how she was opposed to socialism, and she was standing at the gate to protect America from socialism. America is not as afraid of socialism as they are of the people whom Warnock would appear to represent, to racist, white, Georgians. You take the healthcare crisis in this country. I would maintain if there were few or no Blacks in the country, we might have universal health care. But whites have shown the inability to act in their own interest in this country in an effort to prevent certain things from being helpful to the Africans. Another important book for your audience is the book recently written by Professor Eddie Glaude, building on the work of James Baldwin, Begin Again. So when you talk about how individuals benefit, but the structures don't change, that's about as old news to me as you can think. I mean, the point is, though, the African has no option but to struggle in this country. And I wanted this book, after many conversations with Sarah and Sonia, Sarah Smith and Sonia Malepu, I decided that when Reverend Spooner and Reverend Jackson undertake to argue in the new dispensation of this racist thing, they will have the benefit of what their elders had done in a similar vein. In fact, the freedom that we seek is not a bench by the side of the road where we go, we get to the bench, we sit down and rest. It's a matter of eternal vigilance. And every gain by Black people in America has benefited large segments of the white population. But, as you know, I'm a native Georgian. I observed many Euro-Americans, call them white for the sake of discussion, who often had a much lower standard of living than I did. But they took comfort in calling me the N-word. And that is an ingenious creation to sort of divide the populations. I look at Reverend Barber's sort of reviving Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, for example. And you have to ask, why is it that the white poor is leery of becoming a part of something like this? They are hamstrung by the historic structural nature of the caste that Wilkerson writes about. Will it ever end? We don't know, but our option is to struggle. We have to keep on struggling. That's the story. That's our music. That's our literature. That's our food. That's our dance. You see, that's our style. We have to keep struggling, but we understand that the freedom we seek can never take place within the context that human beings are relegated to a certain place in society because of the nature of their birth, because of the color of their skin. This is an old American reality. And if we look at Reconstruction, there is no more palpable hope in American history that we had reached a place where we would somehow break free.
Right.
But the American personality reined it in. In 1968, leading up to Martin's death, we had the problem of the Vietnam War, to be sure, that was looming very large. But there was a presumption before the 67 Riverside Church speech, when Martin announced that if the United States functioned perfectly according to its foundation, it would generate what he called the giant triplets. You remember that speech, right?
Absolutely.
Racism, poverty and violence. And so here we are today. And to be very contemporary, we have the logical progression of this sickness emerging now at the top office in the land, where the chief executive of the nation is provoking violent protests against elected officials simply because they won't be a partner with him in overthrowing an election.
Mm-hmm.
So you've seen in the last 4 to 5 years, the Republican Party abandon any notion of balanced budgets, of free trade. You're right down the line of the great principles of the so-called Republican Party gone. And now the last one is democracy, the myth of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
We had no democracy in this country before 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. That's when democracy was born in America. And now it's been dying a slow death. So Black Not Dutch is really meant to be some kind of instrument for the next wave of the struggle.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing us back to Reconstruction, even thinking through, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are also radical, sweeping structural changes that initially put checks on on the slaveocracy, on plantation power, and resulted in the enfranchisement of Black male voters, and that there were more African American elected officials nationwide in the 1870s than there were in the 1970s because of the again retrenchment, this kind of rhyme to find new ways to withhold those rights and privileges. So I think that's important that you bring us back even to.
And look, Nate, let's just plug here because you mentioned the name of James Beardsley. I was privileged to know him. He's indicative of the contradiction in America. The culture swings in the way that I've inadequately described, but there were always individuals, even small movements, who were against slavery, who were quick to point out the caste system of the United States and to oppose it. People lost their lives long before the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
So you have it today. When young people ask me about the white people joining in the Black Lives Matter movement, is this, how distinctive is this? They ask me. Brother Bill, by the way, don't call me Doc, okay? So Brother Bill, is this unique? No, it's not unique. I had white people sleeping on my grandmother's living room floor in the 1960s.
Mm.
But if white people could have found them, they would have strung them up quicker than me. So let's be aware that all along the way, you've had the dominant society definitely moving in a structurally racist kind of way. And then you've had these sort of, I don't know if you would call them pioneers or allies, but you get my point.
Yeah.
It's that way, and it's that way today as it has been all along.
I think there's, you have a line in the book that says there was no lack within the RCA. You said there's people who understand the structural problem, and you say there was no lack of insight into the problem, just a lack of will. And I think that, and elsewhere, Gay Wilmore writes that part of the failures of not RCA but of other mainline responses to the Black Manifesto was that Wilmore says that white congregations that saw themselves as liberal, saw themselves as engaged, were getting fatigued of the movement, especially as, like you mentioned, King starts making it not just about integration, right? That some of these white churches that saw themselves as liberal and engaged in struggle really wanted a kind of like assimilationist integration.
But my friend, let me tell you this. I always knew that it was much easier for me to announce a prophetic vision than it was for a white person who wanted to. Every human being, every animal has to eat. And when I stood up at Bethany Baptist Church and talked about things that I guess you could never have talked about in the Christian Reformed Church unless you wanted to eat out of a garbage can, right? I understood the sacrifice of the liberal white guy. He wants to go to Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Do you understand? And the consequences of being alienated from people who look like you, who are related to you. So when I knew Ann Braden in Louisville, Kentucky, I mean, for a white woman and her husband to take the stand that they took, or Miles Horton, you see, for white Southerners to take a stand against racism required more courage in some ways than people like Martin Luther King. So, but it is true. I mean, at last count, 27 people in the US Congress who call themselves Republicans have acknowledged that Mr. Biden has been elected president. Do I think that only 27 people know that or agree with that? But they got to eat. Now, I can appeal to people to gather the courage to act prophetically, but that's really a personal choice.
Right.
And when you talk about diversity, you talked about that in your introductory remark. You said that the book revealed that there were diverse views in the Black community. Mm-hmm. What else is new about that? I mean, what else can I go to Orange City and find 10 people who agree with each other on any bunch of issues? Why is it that Black people are expected to be sort of monolithic, or Puerto Ricans for that matter? You see, what do the Puerto Ricans think? When they were talking about the Latinos voting in diverse ways in the election, I took a chuckle because they're only talking about people who speak the Spanish language.
Right.
Now, are they all supposed to be of one mind? This is the kind of, look, and by the way, Black people betraying the cause of freedom is about as new in American history as fresh air, my friend. It's nothing new. If you find some Black person running behind racists and pretending to be a part of their circle, and you do see that, this is nothing new. It happened in slavery. It happened in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King's organization was infiltrated by Black people. Right. Malcolm was killed by Black people. You see? So no big thing. And the struggle is not a racial struggle, but to white people who are given privilege, even when they don't ask for it, are they willing to sacrifice to travel with the Black folk who are already on the margins? And white people don't, and no people would elect to live on the margins. And that's what you have to decide if you're going to travel with Doc Howard, right?
That's on your shoulders. I want to ask this: if there's limits to people's willingness to count to like actually pay the cost of what it takes. I'm thinking not just about the costs of activism, but how different our own moment now is in terms of the tools for activism and where those tools can actually be marshaled for advocacy, for a structural change. So in your book, you've got, there are even for church leaders that come to serve in the Black Council and church leaders such as the National Council of Black Churchmen and others, you have the church occupying a different kind of role in society in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s than it does today. And you have other institutions.
Well, I'm not sure that's true.
Okay. Well, tell me
Sure
about that, but also tell me how, like, things like labor unions, right, and other organizations that, my own sense is that there's a diffusion of information in such the way that I'm not sure people think about unions in the same kind of strong identification, or even denominations in the kind of strong identification that they perhaps did in the 1950s and 60s and 70s.
Well, Black Not Dutch is the subject of this Zoom, and I don't talk about labor unions in the book. So let's plan another Zoom and talk about that. But labor unions have been the target of right-wing politics. And I have many opinions about what has transpired since the PATCO union was destroyed by Ronald Reagan, and what has happened with the investments offshore in places like South Korea when it was under a military dictatorship, or Marcos in the Philippines, and various other countries where, if you look at your jacket, chances are it was made in one of those countries, not by the International Labor Ladies Garment Workers Union. The American consumer was led to think, okay, if we can get this made in Thailand, and I don't mean to pick on Thailand, the thing that you buy will cost less. So we have a downward spiral where everybody's rushing to the big box store or Amazon, and what they're noticing is small businesses are drying up all around them, and the wages that people are willing to work for are pittance compared to what union workers made when the Midwest manufactured things. See, I was ordained in Rockford, Illinois. It was a big industrial town, a big machinist union place. You work in the factory, you owned a boat, you had a pickup, you could send your kids to the junior college and had a little saving. Maybe you went up to the Wisconsin Dells for a week on vacation. But now that's gone, because if I go to Rockford, there are no factories, high crime, all of the things that come in the post-industrial period. So that's a subject we can talk about when you invite me back. And I can also talk about the role of churches. You see, there's not one national church except the Episcopal Church that retains its headquarters in New York City since the days this book was written. The Presbyterians went to Kentucky. The Methodists went to Nashville. The United Church of Christ went to Cleveland. They're all chasing their increasingly conservative, inward-looking constituency. Decline in support for theological education. The virtual abandonment of college and high school level youth programs that align themselves with the World Student Christian Federation. All of that is gone. Support for the ecumenical organizations. And the reason why the ecumenical movement shrank within our country is because leaders of the ecumenical movement, like Marion de Velder of the Reformed Church, or Ari Brouwer later, is because those people became connected to people around the world in Africa, Asia. They came back to the United States being much more sensitized to the issues in those places. Mm-hmm. When you went to the World Council of Churches, you sat next to Bishop Tutu and you heard the cry of his people. And then you came back to New York and you said, I heard it from Bishop Tutu. You see, we didn't want to hear that. We wanted to be America first.
If we could just take a moment and broaden the discussion a little, because it's wonderful listening to both of you, but we have other people in the room. I'm going to invite Dr. McCreary. Dr. McCreary has patiently had his hand raised.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Hey.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you both?
I'm good, man.
Great.
Brother Dr. Howard, Brother Dr. Jeremy Brink. Good to see you both. Question, just two really broad questions from the book. One is the Reverend Eli Tiemann from South Africa still living? That's the first.
He passed away some time ago. Well, you would know that, James. Was he your contemporary at seminary?
He wasn't my contemporary. I did meet him. He actually spoke at my commencement in '87.
Okay.
But he has since passed away.
I think there was 1 year of overlap that Len Bethel had with him, and Len talked about some memories of Reverend Tema in our October conversation.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Good man.
Oh, yeah, I would love to spend some more time with that thought. So I'll follow.
Zachariah Mokwebo, who was a mentee of Tema's, may still be alive, and he also studied at New Brunswick. So if you could establish a connection with Zachariah Mokwebo, I think that would be a good one. And offline we can put our heads together to see how we might connect with them.
Okay. And the other was, I know you ended your relationship formally in '92, and I believe that Dr. Warren Dennis came on after that to New Brunswick, but with that overlap being in urban metro ministry, any stories or talks about that collaboration?
No, as a matter of fact, if I met Warren Dennis, I always knew that he was there. Mm-hmm. If I met him, it was very briefly. I had no connection at all. Now, I lectured at a course that was being taught at New Brunswick by Richard Roper once. Richard was, I don't know that he was even a regular adjunct, but he taught a course maybe at the urging of Warren Dennis on public policy, something like that, because that's Richard's field. Mm-hmm. And I knew and worked with James Seawood, mm-hmm. although I never entered the classroom at his urging or anything. I spoke to some assemblies, in the chapel, mm-hmm. But I didn't know Dennis.
One thing you mentioned in the book is this rise of the language of urban churches, and you suggest that that's really just code talk.
Yes, that's right. And let me just say, I understood there were different dynamics in churches that were in core cities that did not have to be Black or brown, but that became a code word for those churches. Yeah. Do you understand my point? In other words, if you had a white working class church in the north side of Chicago and you called it an urban church, I get that. Very different from a ex-urban or rural church, in terms of different community dynamics.
Right.
But it became a catchword for urban church, and urban ministry had the same connotation. And let me just say, as you see, I felt this way by writing it in the book. many white pastors serving congregations were perceived by some, not to say they perceived it themselves, as missionaries to the urban churches. And when we began to talk about self-reliance, which was we didn't really mean anything threatening by it. I just felt to be authentically a part of the church, to be a real non-racial partner in the building of the church, you couldn't be just constantly dependent on handouts from the churches. Right. And that was the motivation. But boy, did it strike a chord.
Yeah.
And some white pastors, not all, were quite threatened by this because they could not imagine how they could build self-reliant congregations from among the Black folk who attended these churches. And some of them, maybe not all, were actually receiving, unbeknownst to their consistories, contributions from churches in places like Northwest Iowa and Western Michigan. So the whole notion of, and I define what we mean by self-reliant, because there are enormous needs in all of these churches. Do we want partners to join with us in addressing those needs? Yes. But I don't want churches from outside the community paying the pastor.
Right.
Do you see?
Right.
So that was a very,
yeah, I mean,
we didn't know what we were getting into when we.
Right, they were using the funding mechanism of global missions and subsidizing white pastors to work in Black communities, not promoting a sustaining model. So I guess one question that I have too, as you know, and we have President McCrary asking some questions about the book, so I know he's very engaged as well. How then does, if even something as the concept of urban missions, of urban ministry, comes from this kind of fraught history, and often baked in to all of that is a white paternalism from white mainline denominations. How then does one, is the seminary that has urban or metro urban ministry, you know, or and you have experience at NYTS as a seminary president as well. How, since so many of these things that the church has inherited to do its work, to do its thinking, to frame its engagement, if so many of these things have a kind of structural linkage to white normative paternalistic systems, you know, what is there a way out, or are we left with Audre Lorde to say the tools of the master will never tear down the master's house? Mm-hmm. You know, and so the question is, you know, is there some angle? Is there some place for, you know, even theological education within white mainline denominations to make some move that might offer something prophetic and not just a rehash of these kinds of paternalistic frames?
Well, I don't know. I think we have to do a little, this is a good Christian notion. We have to do a little confessing. Those who have lived in the paradigm of privilege have to acknowledge that some of the most American success stories are of people who are quite mediocre, but white. And some of the greatest achievements of the country have been by Black people who had one hand tied behind them. We have to do some confession that we are floating on the same ball together, and we are prepared to live as human beings. But that requires more of you. I don't mean you, Nate, because you chose a certain position, but the society has placed in your lap certain givens that you didn't necessarily ask for, but from which you benefit. And I don't have I can only tell you that until you renounce that, and until you are a part of a larger body of fellows, women and men, and Eddie Glaude puts it very well in the book. He said, and excuse this reference, but I have to say it, we have no obligation to worry about the people who are supporting our president. We simply have to build a new society where race and gender discrimination, discrimination against people because of their sexual orientation, all of these things that we have, by the way, stupidly amalgamated with the Christian gospel. You see, we have to build a society where all people are welcome, all people have worth, all people are affirmed.
Mm-hmm.
Shy of that, we're all locked in. Take foreign mission. I understood urban mission, call it ministry if you will, to be the exact same paradigm as foreign mission. Okay? You put a lot of money in, you send somebody abroad, they live among the natives, but they live not a relationship of solidarity,
Mm-hmm.
but implicit superiority.
Right.
You see? And Eugene Heidemann, do you know that name? He was once head of the program agency of the Reformed Church. Brilliant guy who I think may have taught at Central College, but he was a missionary to India, I believe. And when I would go out to Central to visit Wilbur Washington, he would always be a house guest and we would have great dinners together. And he would tell me about all the Dalit people who would become Christian, right? They weren't really Christian, but they joined the Christian church because it elevated their status in India. You see? So it's very complicated, this notion of white racism has captured the imagination of people who benefit too much from turning their backs on it. And that's the challenge. I think it's a faith question. I think it's a moral question. In Black Not Dutch, you see it populated throughout the book. You have individuals like Beardsley, but others. But there are others named there who pop up in the middle of the book speaking a contrarian voice. And as we talked the other day, in writing this book, I went back into the minutes of the General Synod, way back into the 18th century, looking at what was being said. And of course, one of the interesting things was by the time we get to, say, around 1840 or so, you'd have these theologians on the Senate floor speaking for slavery in eloquent terms and quoting the scripture. But you'd always have another person, probably Dutch, speaking on the same floor, taking the opposite position. So that's sort of the ongoing story of America. I think that Eddie, the title of his book is Begin Again. The question is, are we at a point of another civil war? Or are we at a point of reinventing the country, acknowledging that we were at our beginning a slave state? New Jersey, for example, is the last of the northern states to free slaves. The last 16 slaves in this state were freed in 1865. Slavery was outlawed in New York in 1817, and they gave them 10 years to adapt to it. So it went into effect in 1827. New Jersey, 1865, where New Brunswick Seminary is located. And you've had some interesting, I've been reading Kendra Boyd's writings about New Brunswick. Rutgers, of course, has a similar history. Princeton is rolling over, just bathing in it. And they were a part of the Liberian myth. You see, that's another part of the American racist story. Mm-hmm. The creation of a nation by purchasing land and corrupting the tribal kings. You see, this is the predicament. And I sometimes think, why are Black people leading the anti-racism struggle? It's not our problem. Nate, you got to get your contemporaries to lead this struggle. And we won't need any Black, not Dutch books in the future, you see?
Yeah, well, honestly,
I'm going to muscle my way back into this conversation again to invite Rick DeBrine, who's a pastor from California, to bring up the question that he was bringing up some time ago. Rick, go ahead and unmute and share.
I was just wondering what it might say, if anything, that General Synod could never get the move to Michigan approved. It came year after year after year, but eventually they did it anyway.
Wow. I never knew how that happened until one day I called the pension board and I got referred to Michigan. Didn't know the story behind it. But as I say in the book, I think, yes, or in the foreword or the introduction, I say, if the church had not been headquartered in New York, this whole story would never have been written because, the Interchurch Center was where the activists went to occupy the office, and the New York is with its own problems, of course, is really where humanity meets. And if you take yourself out of that context, you run the risk of not encountering certain kinds of controversy. And in my view, the church is richer when it has some access to controversy and debate to keep the theology percolating,
One thing that I think may be, said about that is that, if the church was to pursue a kind of isolationist or a sort of ethno-religious retrenchment on the basis of fear, which is what Beardsley says was the trend. That's very difficult to do in New York and New Jersey, where the history of Dutch Reformed people involves a lot of assimilation.
Right. Yeah.
Meeting up with Congregationalists, having a sort of Presbygational moment where they, even in the 19th century, letting go of Dutch, much earlier, whereas the isolationism was much more viable in a place like Michigan, or Chicago, where my ancestors had come to, by the 1850s, 1890s, 19-teens even, right?
Right.
They still had it wasn't so hollow to claim an ethno-religious isolationism if you did it in Pella or Holland.
Well, see, Beardsley said fear, but Erskine said there was a lot of debate within the church, which did not allow it to look outward. I think maybe a mixture of those. But, Wilbur Washington, as far as I could tell, in this sort of more modern period, was the first Black person to serve in a Reformed church when he was invited, I think as a student from New Brunswick, to assist the pastor of Mott Haven, which by then had become predominantly Black in the Mott Haven section of the Bronx. 1955, for a church that had been here since, the early 17th century, and the Presbyterian church, the Scottish church, had a Black caucus in New York in the 1840s. So something was going on, whether it was a preoccupation with the ethnic identity or some other types of internal issues that needed to be resolved. The Reformed Church was aloof in some ways, but as Wilkerson writes in her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the flooding of the old cities of the North, and Chicago was certainly one of them, just forced old line European ethnic communities to, well, then of course you had the GI Bill, which allowed some of them to move out to the far South Side, you see, or in the case of New York, over to Jersey, or further up in Essex County, away from Newark. I had a good friend who told me, I think it was Essex Fells, was created as a kind of white community fleeing Montclair because too many Black folk were moving into Montclair. And he told me about how he and his family made a decision not to leave. And he was quite wealthy. He could have gone anywhere. But these, and the point that our friend raised about the church debating whether to leave New York, I've sat in on some of those debates. I've been at General Synods where these issues were debated. And you see the staff of the Reformed Church in New York, I tell you, with no pejorative comment about the staff in Michigan. I'm sure they're wonderful people, but the staff by nature was quite diverse. You had Black people, Spanish speaking people. We had a guy on our staff in New York from Afghanistan, I think. He was Assyrian, so he would have been from Iraq. He was from Iraq. We had a woman in the finance office from India. From Egypt. We had a man from India. You see, you're not going to get that mix. My own assistant was from Panama. And by the way, the so-called Dutch people on the staff, they loved it. They were enriched by that. But you are although Western Michigan is getting more diverse these days, I think you won't approach New York for a long time. And I think I don't mean to say that's all the reason, but that has to be considered part of the reason. Black folks see everything through the lens of race. You just need to know that.
Yeah. Well,
even the pandemic and the vaccine, you see.
Yeah.
White people are saying to me, my friends, they say, why are Black people so reluctant to take this vaccine? When Black people are dying, we need some way to help Black people not die. I said, turn back to Tuskegee and read up on the syphilis experiment. Black people are familiar with this stuff, and we live with this history in our heads, and I'm not so sure it should apply today. Mm-hmm. I intend at some point, I guess I need to see some rich dignitaries take it first, but I intend to take the vaccine. But don't be surprised when the victims of medical experiments are reluctant to be a guinea pig.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want
James, don't let us get too far away from that book now. Because This man has many interests.
I want to circle back to one person, and one of the things, and I mentioned this in my opening comment, but the work of Ms. Millie Green really stood out, and
yes,
the role of education, because I think that's one of the things that you point out in bringing it back to what the Black Manifesto was asking for. So many times it's thought of as like they're making a practical ask about money. But they're also saying that racist white Christianity has told a lie, and that needs a structural educational readjustment. And someone like Millie Green represents, I think, this person in your account who takes that work on and advances that work. And I can't help but notice that I can't see all of the panelists, but I can see some of my students who are in attendance who are Black women who are candidates for ordination in the Reformed Church of America. And just to think about that, I think, and seeing the ways that like in education and programming, maybe not even that's about bending the whole denominational mechanism, but that's just about empowering people in their communities.
Yes. Yes.
You know, I think sometimes, especially in this era of corporations, Amazon being able to say Black Lives Matter, in some ways it's so big that it's hollow. And I think that kind of activity to just sit and do Sunday school differently, saying in a way that does Sunday school for Black children that promotes their empowerment. That is so antithetical to the kind of blanket statements and denominational work. And I really think that that's maybe where you shine light on something that's really life-giving that maybe needs to be cultivated yet again.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for zeroing in on that, because Millie Green, Faraja Nkrumah, was one of the great personalities mentioned in the book, and a great colleague. But keep it close to Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter, which I read this week, has been placed in a police training manual as an example of a terrorist group. And Black Lives Matter gave rise to Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. People can't come to terms with the fact that this slogan grew out of the fact that for centuries it would appear that Black lives did not matter. And what the saying is really saying is not other people's lives don't matter. They're saying Black lives matter too. And when Faraja created the Black Christian Education Program, she was trying to say to her colleagues with whom she had, I would say, very positive relations, you're teaching us white Christian education. You're teaching us a notion of Christianity that emerges from the presumption of white superiority. You see, most white Christians don't understand that they have undertaken to submerge the gospel under the doctrine of white supremacy. Mm. You see, in other words, you have Christian education and I have Black Christian education, when in fact you have white Christian education, and I'm trying to say, wait a minute, doesn't Jesus also speak to these people in their voice? Mm-hmm. And that is, by the way, a wonderful story to read and reread and to probe and ask questions. By the way, Faraja is still alive. You might want to give her a call sometime. I don't know how to reach her, but I can help you. And I watched her, and I hope she's not on this call because she'll spank me if she is, but I watched Faraja come alive, because if there are people on the call, they will remember Faraja was on the staff certainly before I came to the Reformed Church. Now, whether she was there before the Black Manifesto, see, that would have been 3 years before I arrived. But she was really well accepted, and she fit in. And Art Van Eck was her boss, and they had a great relationship. But I saw her come alive. She began to think about the unique calling on her life as a Black woman in this white denomination in a way that I don't think she had before. And my Lord, when she went to Africa, she had an explosion of awareness. She changed her name. She began to speak with a different voice. And some of her colleagues embraced her, but some of them began to say, gee, is this the Millie Green we knew? And that's, eventually she decided to depart from the church. And the people in Brooklyn from New Lots, by the way, I think New Lots would be a good locus of understanding of Millie Green, because I think she may have been based there, maybe by, I guess Bill Hanasek may have been there when she was there. He would know her. Sarah would know her very well. But thank you for highlighting her story.
Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, the Reformed Church, as you can see, she had a wonderful successor in Wynne Wright Potter. Wynne went on to do a PhD and taught on the faculty at Union Seminary before she passed away. But I think the Black Christian education movement sort of faded away. For example, I don't know, what is the Black Council or African American Council today? I think it may have suffered the, the consequences of the nature of the society, and it's been watered down to something else. I don't know what it is. I don't mean to say that the work they do now is not as vital as the work we did, but I have the impression that it's been, I don't know if the word is neutered. That's not the right word, but
yeah.
something.
I mean, I think the idea that like if they make recommendations that the denomination does not take, right? There's a kind of a difficulty in achieving the ends that they seek. And some of those things that they're up against, I think, are structural.
Yes.
And this, I think, this I had a conversation with Dr. Reverend Deborah Mullins, who really talked about, Black Presbyterian. She's done writing on Black Presbyterian response to the Black Manifesto, and talking about the ways in which then and now, the denominational structures have made sure that Black clergy within those structures have had bark, but not bite. And I think that I come back to that sometimes, that in some ways there's a structural disempowerment.
But wait, I want you to bear with me on this one, because I'm going to make a subtle point, and I hope folk will hold on to this. Here's my experience. A liberal white person comes to me and denounces another white person who's trying to be liberal, but they're not there yet, or trying to be progressive, they're not there yet. And they're always surprised at how patient I am with these people, okay? And I'm patient in that regard with the Reformed Church in America. You may say that individuals have benefited from these things, but the structures remain the same. The truth of the matter is, we're working our way into the gizzard of the Reformed Church in a way that we can never be extracted. You know? I mean, it's like a guy growing up in Pella, listening to Dutch folk music or something, and then he hears Nina Simone and starts crying, you know, and he doesn't know why. You know? You see, it is that the African is America, and the white folk don't know it yet. You see, look, when I look at those marvelous young people there, they're not so young anymore, at Second Hackensack. See, I knew Jack White and I knew Ella White. They were there serving when I was there. Ella, of Japanese background, and Jack, a so-called white guy, right? And then I look at them serving that church. You see, we're creeping up on you. And we don't mean you any harm. See, the angle is Black people will come to power and do to us what we have done to them. And Black folk are just trying to get you out of their business, you know? I mean, so don't be too hard on the small steps forward. Black folk know there will be steps backward, but then we'll step forward again. And what I said recently in a Facebook post is white nationalists in America had better come to terms with the truth that without Africans, there is no America. There simply isn't, in so many ways. And when you think of the way we have built this country and how the African skills were vital in the building of the country, where colonialists acknowledged that without the skills Africans brought, and I'm not talking just strong bodies, but skills. Right. You see, and you know, the funny thing Bill Howard likes to say is all the white nationalists ought to be subject to a DNA test, and you'll find just how white they really are. Because your son needs to know, you look white, but you could be a Black guy from Georgia. You see, I mean, this is America. And the Black Council, the capacity of Black members in the Reformed Church to be pure advocates for the world that they saw, and they could report that to the church in earnest, not as a power move, but reporting things into the church, in my view, strengthen the Reformed Church. And if the Reformed Church does not welcome that pure voice, or if it is cutting off the vehicles that produce that voice, it is actually hurting itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. James, I believe you're muted.
Yeah.
Yep. I would love to allow this conversation to go on all night, but we can't do that. And we are past the time we had announced, but I want to let Michael Edwards, who's been patiently waiting, go ahead and get in the last question or comment, and then there'll be a little closing housekeeping and we'll head on our way. Michael?
Let me just thank James for this opportunity to have you just present this book, Black but Not Dutch. There are so many things to say, and I think in the course of the Black Council, there've been gains and there've been transformation. And in that transformation of those years, in the 70s and 80s, we were really equipping church leaders to become voices at General Synod. to articulate, along with their brothers and sisters, justice and peace and equality. And the council still continues to, in really the Eastern region, becomes the advocate, but at the same time, we continue to not look to seek power, but to equip our churches to enrich the life of diversity in the Reformed Church in America. And so, thank you, Dr. Howard, for just bringing that portion of history back to us, that we can think about the Black Manifesto of 50 years ago. And 50 years ago was a time where there were concerns about African Americans coming to the church. And then there was a structural change. And 50 years now, there's a Vision 2020. Wow. And let me close with that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Thank you, Dr. Jeremy Brink. The title of the book is Black, Not Dutch, The Reformed Church in America's Response to the Black Manifesto. There will be similar conversation that will pick up on themes from this discussion in March. On March 13th, which is a Saturday, we will have the annual Women's Stories Day at the Reformed Church Center, and the presenter, the Hazel B. Gennady Scholar for this year, is the Reverend Anna Jackson, who will be presenting Like Trees Planted by Water, RCA New York City Black Women Lay Leaders of the 1950s through 1970s. So I hope that some of you can be in on that conversation as well. As we get ready to leave tonight, for many of us over the weekend, our hearts and minds have been with the congregation of Middle Collegiate Church in New York City. And in the wake of that devastating fire, we are grateful that there were no serious injuries, but we are keeping them in our prayers. And I would like to invite Dr. McCreary to say a prayer with all of us now before we go.
Can I just mention that when you announced the Zoom, you gave people the option of ordering the book from me or from Amazon. And if you order it from me, I'd like to, and you'll write me a note and tell me who you are. I'd like to write a little something special to you. Amazon can't do that. The bald-headed guy that runs Amazon, he wouldn't know you anyway. So I would write you a special note. And I have to say, before the president speaks, I've looked at the list of participants and I've seen so many familiar names. And Roland Ratmeyer is one of them, and Thelma Ellis and Terry Troika, of course, Sharon Atkins, and John Paulberg was my colleague at the Reformed Church. I won't try to name everybody, but it's an interesting, having been away from the church for so many years, good to see so many familiar names. Thank you, James.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Howard. Dr. McCreary? Dr. McCreary, you are still muted. Oh.
Yes. One of the statements that was made in this conversation is that there's sometimes steps forward and also steps backwards. And even though we know that the ecclesia, the church, is a called out ones, it's not a building, that building still represented so much. And there's so many memories there. So let us pray. God of hope and peace, as we struggle during this Advent to find peace, peace connected to elections, peace connected to murders and deaths of people of color, peace connected to the disenfranchisement of the votes of people of color. and women, we find in our community, Middle Collegiate Church, a church that is talking about revolutionary love, a church that states no fire can stop revolutionary love, a church that has been a beacon for hope, a beacon for possibility, a beacon for love and unity, community and connectedness, a church with a prophetic ministry. We pray for them now. Specifically, we ask that you would comfort their hearts, their souls, their minds, their spirit, their ministries, that you would be the God of presence, that you would walk with them. We thank you for those who are holding their hands physically and walking with them as they look at the skeletal remains of the sanctuary. We thank you for those who have been trained in how to love and those who just love. We know that even during this pandemic, when they could not meet all the time together collectively in the building, it still was a hub, a place they were looking forward to coming back to. And so we join them, oh God. We connect our faith with their faith, our hope with their hope, our love with their love, that there might be resurrection for that revolutionary love, that you might restore, that you might make better what has been destroyed. We pray, Lord, just for strength in the valley as they march again to the mountaintop. We ask this and many more things as we just take a moment to silently reflect and give our individual prayer of concern, prayer of blessing, prayer of hope to that congregation. These and many more things we pray in the precious name of our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and being part of this conversation. Good night, everybody. I look forward to seeing you again at another conversation soon. Dr. Howard has dared us to invite him back, and he's going to find out that we follow through on those things. So
When the pandemic
Take
is
care.
over, you can invite me to the seminary, all right?
I look forward to it.
Very good.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.